Russian government says mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin died in a fiery plane crash Wednesday. The plane crashed north of Moscow, killing all 10 people on board. The head of the mercenary group Wagner led a brief armed rebellion against the Russian military and his old buddy, President Vladimir Putin, just weeks ago. Here to break down the oddly timed crash and what it means geopolitically and what it means right here in the U.S., right here in Illinois, Dr. Dick Farkas, professor of political science at DePaul. Dr. Farkas, thank you for joining us.
Great to have the opportunity, Brad.
I guess first things first, coincidence? I mean, it seems all those who cross Putin go away or die. Prigozhin, at one point in time, was one of his top lieutenants, too.
Yeah. It's a twisted story, for sure, very much like the background of the guy himself. The truth of the matter is that Putin's not unhappy with Prigozhin's demise. The typical Russian is responding, as one would predict, that Putin keeps his promises, and that if somebody crosses him, eventually it will come home to roost. Most Russians think that when Putin speaks, his words are predictive. And in this particular case, that will contribute some evidence. The more complex question, though, is really which of the various subsets of people who might have an interest in this happening turn out to be the perpetrators. You know, Prigozhin had many admirers, but many, many more, legions of enemies.
Right.
And there are at least 5 possibilities, all of which have some argument for probability.
Yeah, I guess if you really look beyond it, I mean, hypothetically, it could be the Ukrainians. I mean, this guy attacked Ukraine, right? But, I mean, the timing is very incident. Just a few weeks ago, he tried to almost do a coup against Putin, and then Putin sends him off to Belarus, which is basically the president there is Putin's BFF, so I wouldn't want to be watched over if I was Prigozhin by the president of Belarus. But okay, so it seems like, though, to me, this should be topic A in America, or at least topic A, B, or C. In Wednesday's Republican debate, the Russia question, the plane falling from the sky, wasn't even asked. Candidate and former ambassador Nikki Haley worked it into an answer, but the question was not asked. If it was 80, 1990, 2000, 2010, and all of Putin's enemies are either going away or dying, you'd think it'd be asked, right?
Well, let's be clear. I'm no expert in American politics, but like most of my colleagues and in political science and most Americans, I think we get confused by what it is that motivates the public statements of our politicians. And in this particular case, American foreign policy doesn't have much in the way of choices. The truth of the matter is we're relegated to an adversarial relationship by the nature of what Putin's done. Now, the question for candidates like the ones on the dais and others is, can they approach the subject without the simplicity of basic American dialogue? Can they show themselves to have some depth of understanding? For that, they'd have to turn to some expertise. And by and large, the pattern today among American politicians is not to surround themselves by people who are knowledgeable about whatever subject we're talking about, in this particular case, foreign policy.
Yeah, and I pointed out the only one who even brought it up in a question was former UN ambassador Nikki Haley, who has some geopolitical sophistication. So just recently, anti-corruption Russian activist Alexei Navalny was sentenced to 19 years in jail for what they call a, quote, extremism. He was Putin's probably biggest, most popular detractor. He survived a poisoning. Russia is still holding Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. If you're Secretary of State, let's say you get the call tomorrow, I know it's a crazy hypothetical, or if you're a diplomat and you've got to deal with Putin, and you do have the sophistication of knowledge, you mentioned, though, underlying adversarial relationship, what do you do?
Well, I think it's difficult. I think the negotiations that we conduct in the margin for other people who are detained both ways is easier because it's out of public view. Navalny is an interesting character. He is certainly the lightning rod for opposition against Putin. But there are a number of things that those of us that study politics there have to remind folks about. One is that he's really not a viable political alternative.
Right.
He's the voice of opposition. And while that's significant, in a sense, he draws attention away. Notice you haven't heard about other names. It's always about Navalny and about how he's been subject, how he's been the target.
That's good.
What we don't hear are other names of viable political engaged people. So in a sense, in a strange sort of sense, Putin is comfortable with all of the attention that Navalny gets. And every time he increases the penalties, and this is a significant increase and added 17 years to his sentence, it demonstrates that Putin is singularly in control of the legal system.
That is so interesting. I've never thought of that way, but the Navalny, what you just brought up, I mean, Navalny's a guy with a megaphone. He's not a guy with a position.
Right.
So it's almost as if Putin is just talking about this guy who yells from the sidelines, a cheesehead at a Green Bay Packers fan, who's not legitimately going to run Wisconsin or run, in this case, Russia. That's interesting. And who knows better? Who knows
if our
better
world
about
hadn't changed so dramatically in the media sense, in the global media sense, this is the kind of guy that in the old Soviet system would have been exiled because he would have become invisible. But today, given our media environment, it's impossible for that kind of person to go into exile and be invisible. So that's why he has to be incarcerated.
Yeah, but the fact that Putin in his KGB mind almost plays this guy who's really not competition, makes him the narrative. Fascinating thoughts, Doctor, there. So this all affects the protracted war in Ukraine. You were in Ukraine in 2021 for a project with the U.S. State Department, Russia at war with Ukraine. A lot of those fighters for Russia were Wagner Group mercenaries. Their leader is now dead, dies in a mysterious plane crash after crossing Putin. Ukraine is Putin's war. How does this affect the war?
Well, a couple of ways, but before I get to that, let me simply and briefly say, one of the more interesting things about the advent of the war from roughly 2014 to the actual events in 22, there were always some right-wing elements in Ukrainian politics, but they were so marginalized that they were insignificant.
No, I just want to interrupt you. You're saying people who basically wanted to secede, people, they were right-wing being they wanted to leave Ukraine, right-wing being they wanted to be Russia, right-wing being what?
Well, they wanted, it was actually what Putin calls Nazis or neo-Nazis, people who wanted an authoritarian system to be more deeply rooted in Ukraine. Now, what happened intriguingly is that in Western Ukraine, these groups, which had no traction basically, were well organized. And when the army called, the Ukrainian army called for units to fight, these were groups that were pretty well organized. So the bottom line is that the actual Ukrainian, especially in the Western Ukraine, right-wing groups were already organized in militias and have been fairly effective fighting for Ukraine. In Eastern Ukraine, on the other hand, these same groups with the same political orientation took the side of the separatists and became the people trying to separate Eastern Ukraine from the established Ukraine. And in a sense became one of the foundations for the Wagner Group. Let me mention in passing that one of the things the media has overlooked.
Wrap this in 30 seconds.
Yeah, perhaps the most important thing that I'd share with you is that one of the things that the media has overlooked is who else was on the plane. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that Yevgeny was on the plane. Now, he's actually the man who created the Wagner Group. He was the person with the military expertise. He was the man throughout the Wagner experience, 2014 to today, who is strategizing militarily. Prigozhin was simply the money guy. And the public face. Now, the fact that Prigozhin was killed in the air crash, and Yevgeny leaves the whole prospect of where it's going open-ended.
Wow. Okay, we're going to have to leave you there, but that's a fascinating insight. I know you have more to say, but fascinating breakdown between the inner turmoil how it affects us. Dr. Dick Farkas, we're going to have you on again, professor of political science, DePaul University. Dr. Farkas, thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
You're watching the stream here on CBS.